Good evening and welcome to this edition of History in Highballs as part of the North Carolina Museum of History's History at Home initiative. We're so glad that you're joining us for this evening's program, History in Highballs Air Mount, with guest speaker Grant S. Quirtemus, Curator and Director of Collections for the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. My name is Stacy and I handle adult education over at the museum. So whenever you join us for one of these History in Highballs programs, you and I will virtually get to spend the evening together listening to some incredible stories about North Carolina places and people and what makes our state so special. Tonight's program is just one of many exciting virtual offerings available through MOH. So if you'd like to learn more, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at www.ncmuseumofhistory.org. We would like to take this opportunity to thank our North Carolina Museum of History Associates and Foundation for making this evening's event possible. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which in addition to many other things, helps make programming like this evening's program happen. If you'd like to learn more about becoming an associates member, please head over to their website at www.ncmoha.com. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who graciously donated funds towards this evening's program. We do our best to keep our programming free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping these series going, and we continue to be so appreciative of your generous support of the museum. If you have not already used the link in your registration email to check out the tutorial for this evening's specially themed cocktail, the White Russian, with special guest bartender Mike Beavers of Mingle Bars, we invite you to head over to the museum's YouTube channel and check it out. A few quick housekeeping items for this evening. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the event, and that if you have any questions for our speaker, to please type them into the chat function located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, fellow MOH educator Nancy Pennington will ask the speaker as many of your questions as time allows. All right, so it is my honor to introduce this evening's speaker. Grant Quirtemus is the Curator and Director of Collections for Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. The organization owns and operates Air Mount and 4 other historic houses in New York and South Carolina. Prior to his arrival at CAHPT in August of 2020, he served as curator of Tudor Place, Historic House and Garden, a National Historic Landmark in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. for 5 years. Prior to that, he was the assistant curator at James Madison's Montpelier for 9 years. His book, A Georgetown Life, The Reminiscences of Britannia Wellington Peter Kennan of Tudor Place, was published by Georgetown University Press in October of 2020. He holds an undergraduate degree in history from Murray State University and a master's degree in anthropology from the University of South Carolina. All right, Grant, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to get my PowerPoint set up here and get into presentation mode. So again, thank you for the invitation to speak. Tonight, I'm going to take you all on a virtual tour of Air Mount, the historic house museum in Hillsborough that's owned and operated by Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. In addition to talking about the history of the house and the Kirkland family, I'm going to look at some other aspects of the property's history, including its ties to the 1771 regulator movement and its role in the early history of NASCAR, 2 equally important aspects of North Carolina history. And there's going to be trivia involved as well. I love trivia. I'm a former Jeopardy contestant, and I always like to include trivia on these sort of things. So there's going to be 10 trivia questions spread throughout my lecture tonight. So I encourage you all to keep score, and we'll go over write your answers down. We'll go over the answers at the end of my presentation. I'm going to discuss a young Scottish immigrant who found success in his many business pursuits, constructed a house in 1815 to reflect that success, and whose later indebtedness actually helped preserve many of the architectural details of the house. I'll also regale you of tales of brawling newspaper editors in the streets of early 19th century Raleigh, take you behind the scenes into some rarely seen parts of the house, and look at the Air Mount property as a working 19th century plantation and the enslaved individuals who worked it. Constructed in 1815, Air Mount was home to 4 generations of the Kirkland family until 1985, when it was purchased by Richard Hampton Jenrette. A native of Raleigh and graduate of UNC, Jenrette was a co-founder of the Wall Street firm Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, which at the time of its founding in 1960 was the first Wall Street securities firm started from scratch since the 1930s. As the New York Times noted in Jenrette's 2018 obituary, he was a self-acknowledged houseaholic, and that his interest in historic houses and antiques was piqued by watching Gone with the Wind too many times as a young child. Jenrette developed a passion for restoring historic houses. After owning the Airmount property for 7 years, he donated the site and collection to Classical American Homes Preservation Trust, the nonprofit organization that he founded in 1993, opening the house and grounds for visitation. Today, Classical American Homes Preservation Trust owns 5 properties located in North Carolina, South Carolina, and New York. Due to the COVID pandemic, the house has actually been closed since early April and is going to remain closed for the rest of 2020. So you're in for a treat tonight as we tour the house and focus on some important objects from the collection. I should note that our walking trails around the grounds are still open, so I'll encourage you to come visit the Airmount property and enjoy a socially distanced walk along the Eno River or the historic Occoneechee Speedway Trail that's also on the property. And that's what's interesting about Airmount. The property has a history that spans more than 2 centuries of North Carolina's history. For any NASCAR aficionados in the audience, the Occoneechee Speedway is the only surviving dirt track speedway from NASCAR's inaugural 1949 season. The 1-mile oval track was active for 20 years and now serves as a recreational trail for the Hillsborough community. So that brings us to our first trivia question of the evening. The Occoneechee Speedway Trail hosted the 3rd race of NASCAR's inaugural 1949 season, and Bob Flock won the race in his number 7 car, a 1948 model, and I will let you all decide which of those choices. I made them all multiple choice as well. So let's start with the name. Why is the property called Airmount? To understand the name, you have to understand the man for whom Airmount was built, William Kirkland. Born in Scotland in 1768, Kirkland left his native country in 1789 to journey to America. After achieving personal success in his many business pursuits, he constructed Airmount in 1815, naming the estate after his hometown of Ayr, located in Ayrshire on Scotland's southwest coast. There was another famous Scot who was born and raised near Ayrshire. And this brings me to our second trivia question of the evening. Who was it? Now, this is the only trivia question I'm actually going to give you the answer to because it's the next part of my lecture. That person was Robert Burns, the Bard of Scotland. Many of the places and people that Burns mentions in his poems would have been familiar to William Kirkland. As Burns recounted in one of his verses, "Old Ayr, wham ne'er a town surpasses for honest men and bonny lasses." Sort of sounds like a toast, but then again, most of Robert Burns' poems sound like they should be recited with a glass in hand. In 1789, 21-year-old Kirkland first settled in Warren County, in the town of Warrenton, where he was sent by a Glasgow firm, taking the first step in the trajectory followed by so many other countrymen, from employees to partner to independent businessman and entrepreneur. After living in Warrenton for several years, he entered into a business partnership with John Scott to operate a store, and on Christmas Day of 1792, married Scott's daughter, Margaret. Here's their marriage bond. As Jean Anderson so aptly notes in her book, The Kirklands of Airmount, William Kirkland was one of a significant group of immigrants, young Scotsmen who came to America in the late 18th and early 19th century as representatives of mercantile or tobacco firms. Many of these men, like Kirkland, driven by a strong work ethic and desire to succeed, established their own business, put down roots, and became interwoven into the fabric of communities in which they settled. For the Kirkland family, that community would be Hillsborough, where they moved in 1793. Already more established than Warrenton, Hillsborough was selected as the county seat of the newly formed Orange County in 1754, and the town was laid out by surveyor William Churton. After going through a succession of names, Corbintown, Childsburg, the settlement was finally named Hillsborough in 1766 in honor of the Earl of Hillsborough, Wills Hill, who was British Secretary for the Colonies and a relative of Governor Tryon. So now for trivia question number 3. Orange County was named for William V, Prince of Orange, the Dutch grandson of this reigning British monarch at the time. In addition to its location on the Eno River, the old Indian trading path, which by the late 18th century was known as the Road to Halifax, passed through the town. And I should note that there's still a vestige of this roadway on the Airmount property. William Kirkland wasted no time in establishing his own general store in Hillsborough. He soon began purchasing property, including a house and lot in the town, probably when his family outgrew the space above the store. Then a tract of farm property that he sold 5 years later for almost double the price that he paid for it. And finally, the Airmount tract of 503 acres in 1799, though it would be another 15 years before he would build his brick dwelling house upon it. And I should note that the property had a lengthy occupational history before Kirkland's purchase, going back to prehistoric times. The land around Airmount was home to the indigenous Occaneechi tribe in the Contact era, whose village sites along the Eno were visited by English explorer John Lawson in 1701. The land was part of a 560-acre tract that was granted by the second Earl of Granville in 1760, and in 1763, the western end of the tract was purchased by William Few Sr., a Marylander who moved to Hillsborough and was granted a license to keep tavern, though there's some debate as to whether Few's Tavern was operated out of his house on this property or another property that he owned. I mention William Few because he and his son James played a role in the regulator movement, an aspect of North Carolina's colonial history that's received renewed interest thanks to its role in the past 2 seasons of the Outlander television series, and the novels too. William Few was certainly sympathetic to their cause, giving bond for 2 of the movement's leaders, William Butler and Herman Husband, to assure their appearance for trial. Few's son James fought with the regulators, was captured following their defeat at the Battle of Alamance, and subsequently hanged. As further retribution, the Few farm was ravaged by Governor Tryon's militia. The Few family moved to Georgia, where another son, William Jr., seen here, would go on to represent the state as a signer of the Constitution at the 1787 Federal Convention in Philadelphia. So for trivia question number 4, what fictional Outlander character from the TV series was also a casualty of the 1771 Battle of Alamance, a slight departure from how his death occurred in the series of novels? William Few's house is also important to the Airmount story because Kirkland family tradition holds that it was still standing on the property when William Kirkland purchased the property 30 years later, and it was the house where he and his family resided while Airmount was being constructed. William Kirkland found success with his Hillsborough store and later expanded his business ventures to include a tannery and a cotton gin, as well as other stores throughout the region that he operated as partnerships. Kirkland's Hillsborough store, like his earlier venture with his father-in-law John Scott, would have offered a variety of goods: imported ceramics, glassware, tin, pewter, paper, some groceries, hardware, guns and ammunition, even fabric. That 1820 advertisement noted that he carried a variety of fabrics, including bombazine, a fabric woven with a silk warped and a weft of fine wool used for ladies' dresses. Kirkland's store probably resembled the interior of this store at Old Sturbridge Village. Now, the Kirkland family was also expanding during this time. The couple's first child, daughter Anne, was born in 1794. Another daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later in 1796, and a third, Margaret, in 1797. A son and namesake, William, was born in 1799, but died only a few months later. In total, Margaret Kirkland would have 14 children during a span of 19 years. I'll pause to let that sink in. 14 children during a period of 19 years, between 1794 and 1813. That means she was nearly continuously pregnant or recovering from the birth of a child for the better part of 2 decades. It's also impressive in an era where complications from childbirth were a leading cause of death for adult women that Margaret Kirkland survived 14 deliveries. 10 of the Kirkland children survived infancy, 8 of whom were daughters. So it's easy to make comparisons between Mr. Kirkland and Jane Austen's Mr. Bennet, both presiding over a house of spirited daughters and with a wife who was concerned about locating suitable matches for each of them. Margaret Kirkland is actually a bit of a mystery. As Jean Anderson notes in her 1991 book, none of Margaret Kirkland's letters survive, or that she's rarely mentioned in letters by other family members. And unlike her husband, she never set for a portrait. Margaret's primary focus would have been the daily management of the household and raising the large number of children. William Kirkland's prominence in Hillsborough by the turn of the 19th century is evident in that he was among the men who served as trustees of the Hillsborough Academy when it opened in 1801. And this should not be confused with the earlier Academy of 1785. The school, the 1801 Academy, was advertised as, quote, a school for youth of both sexes, offering instruction in Latin, Greek, English, writing, arithmetic, geography, and even bookkeeping. And you can see Kirkland's name there among the trustees in this newspaper advertisement. And even though he was a trustee of this academy, Kirkland entrusted the education of his daughters to the Moravians, escorting them to Salem in 1804 to the school that's still in existence today and known as Salem Academy. The Kirkland girls, Anne and Emily, as well as Polly Phillips, the ward of family friend Duncan Cameron, were some of the first non-Moravian students to attend Salem Academy as boarding students. The Moravian schools, which had been established in Salem nearly 40 years earlier, had developed such a high reputation both for their moral principles and teachings that many non-Moravian North Carolinians, like Kirkland, sought entry for their daughters in the Moravian schools. That brings me to our next trivia question. Salem Academy is the oldest continually operating boarding school in the state of North Carolina. So what year was it founded? In the fall of 1810, William Kirkland, then 43, crossed the Atlantic and returned to the country of his birth for a lengthy visit that kept him away from Hillsborough for more than a year. Kirkland and his 9-year-old son, John, sailed to London, then traveled north to Edinburgh, Ayr, and Glasgow. Margaret, pregnant with another child, remained in Hillsborough to oversee the household, which by this time comprised of 6 daughters and a toddler son. Their eldest daughter had actually already married and left the household. She would actually give birth to another daughter, their 8th, whom she named Phoebe Bingham during William's time abroad. William returned to North Carolina in the spring of 1812, shortly before the advent of warfare between his adopted country and Great Britain. By the time William Kirkland began construction of Airmount in 1815, he was the patriarch of a large family, a successful businessman, and an active member of the local community. William and Margaret's 2 eldest daughters had already married and left home, beginning families of their own. So William and Margaret were now grandparents, in addition to having a number of children still at home, the youngest being 4-year-old Phoebe. The house that William Kirkland built in 1815 was the first house in Hillsborough to be constructed of brick. It features a 3-bay main block, 40 feet square, flanked by 2 wings, each measuring 24 feet square. The bricks are laid in Flemish bond, featuring modillion cornices, molded windowsills, dressed brick window arches, and a high molded water table. All characteristics that one would expect to see in a house of the 1790s, not a house built in 1815. However, there's good surviving documentation that firmly establishes the date of construction as 1815. It's likely that William Kirkland wanted his house to include some architectural features that he would have been familiar with, maybe that he would have seen in other houses of the region or during his visit abroad, and those that he equated with success. Kirkland actually complains in one December 1815 letter to his son-in-law that brick mason William Collier was overcharging him. He notes, Collier has presented me with an account of the brickwork done on my house. I think he charges me with laying a great many more brick than there is in the house, counting solid walls. The letter provides some great clues, including the exact dimensions of the house and the wings, and establishes the precise date for its construction. And the house was designed to make an impression. Imagine being an early 19th century traveler, making your way into Hillsborough. After spending hours traveling south from Petersburg on the Halifax Road, you come upon Airmount. Not only do you see this house placed prominently on a hill, but you see that it's the epicenter of a working plantation, surrounded by a cluster of outbuildings and fields full of crops or livestock. The completed house was on a scale that eclipsed anything in the vicinity of Hillsborough at that time. Stepping in the front door, you enter a lateral hall that runs the full 40-foot width of the center block. In addition to Mason William Collier, another craftsman who worked on the house was John Joyner Briggs, the carpenter responsible for the stairs and likely the paneling found in the hall and many of the principal rooms. Briggs is also responsible for this staircase at Farintosh, the Durham County home of Kirkland's friend and business associate Duncan Cameron, and there are notable similarities between the 2 houses. Briggs later served as head carpenter for the construction of the Capitol building in Raleigh. Just more of that paneling, because like I said, Airmount features this paneling in nearly all of the principal rooms. One of my favorite features found at Airmount is this section of paneling hidden in a closet beneath the stairs in a second floor hall. The wall wasn't even plastered before someone changed their mind, and the dog-leg staircase leading up to the third floor was placed here, covering the paneling and the bare brick walls, before the plaster even had an opportunity to apply a scratch coat, much less the finer finish layers of plaster upon the brick wall. Another distinct feature of Airmount are the impressively carved mantels found throughout the house. These are likely the work of craftsman Elhanan Nutt of Wake County. Nutt advertised his trade in an 1811 issue of the Raleigh Star newspaper, stating that he was a house carpenter and joiner, ready to execute work in a superior manner to what has been customarily in this place at the common prices with dispatch. In other words, he could do it better, quicker, and at the same price as everybody else. That's some good marketing. Nutt also worked at Farintosh and at Raleigh's Haywood Hall. Nutt's mantels feature an elongated guilloche, sometimes used as a frame for the central panel of the overmantel, and sometimes as a decorative ribbon, as well as a series of linked concentric circles or pinwheels running across the mantel that you can see at the bottom of the image. It's also possible, but it can't be ascertained for sure, that Nutt is responsible for the elaborate cornice that's found in Airmount's dining room seen here, as well as the one in the room that was likely the formal parlor or the drawing room. Nutt's bill for Farintosh survives in the Cameron family papers and shows that he charged Duncan Cameron nearly $200 for the 8 mantelpieces for that house. His charges for the work at Airmount were probably comparable. Nutt's mantels, paneled overmantels, and cornices feature an amalgamation, an interesting combination of both Georgian and federal motifs. Remaining in the dining room for just a moment, one especially notable feature is the large built-in cupboard that would have been used for storage of the family's silver, glassware, and porcelain tablewares. The piece takes up virtually all of the wall space to the right of the mantel. The walnut cupboard with yellow pine secondary features a pair of glazed doors for a central cupboard, surrounded by additional cabinets with drawers below for table linens and probably silver and other tablewares. Again, another common feature shared by both Airmount and Farintosh, photographed here in the 1950s. Another important object in the Airmount dining room, and one that's remained in this space, is the portrait of William Kirkland by Raleigh artist Jacob Marling, an image which I've used several times so far in my presentation. William apparently hung his portrait in the dining room, and it remained in that honored place as the house was owned by subsequent generations of the Kirkland family. Here you can see it in the exact same location in the 1965 Habs photos. One of the first things that Dick Jenrette did after purchasing Airmount was actually remove the portrait from that location and send it to a paintings conservator for some much needed art conservation before returning it to its place of honor above the mantel in the dining room. Marling depicts Kirkland as a no-nonsense businessman in a black frock coat, waistcoat, shirt, and cravat. Marling was a landscape and portrait painter who settled in Raleigh in 1813 and lived there until his death in 1833. And I should say that his work is well represented in the museum's collection. I believe that there are 9 or maybe even 10 portraits, including several that are attributed to him in the collection. The same year that Marling painted Kirkland's portrait, he opened his North Carolina Museum in Raleigh, which featured natural and artificial curiosities, sketches, maps, drawings, paintings, rare coins, and books. Admission was 25 cents, or you could buy an annual pass for $5. That's a great member appeal, even in 1813. Marling advertised his trade as a miniature and portrait painter in a Raleigh newspaper, stating that he was ready to execute any orders in his line at the shortest notice. And I can't discuss Marling without talking about one of his amazing landscapes. And this is one that was actually completed around the same time he completed Kirkland's portrait. And it depicts the female students at the Raleigh Academy during a May Day celebration crowning the May Queen. The painting is in the collection of the Chrysler Museum of Norfolk, Virginia. And it's a great scene. Just look at all the people watching the festivities and all the little vignettes within the painting of the different people and what they're doing. Marling's wife, Louisa, was an instructor of drawing and painting at the Raleigh Academy at this time, probably why Marling painted this scene. And if you look closely, you can see several historical landmarks of several landmarks of historic Raleigh, I should say, in the background, including the girls' building of the academy and which is there on the left, and in the upper right, the weather vane and cupola of the first State House, as this painting was, of course, completed 15 years before the 1831 fire in which it was destroyed. So for our next trivia question, a statue of George Washington by this sculptor was destroyed in the 1831 North Carolina State House fire. Also found in the dining room is the Kirkland family's Sheraton-style dining table, which also remained with the house. It's likely the set of mahogany dining tables that's noted in the 1836 inventory that was taken after William Kirkland's death. The sideboard presently in the room is a New York piece, part of Mr. Jenrette's collection of neoclassical New York furniture, but the Kirkland family would have probably had a sideboard that more closely resembled this one made by a local Hillsborough maker that's documented in the Mesda Craftsman database. Today, the decor of Airmount reflects Dick Jenrette's renovations and furnishings of the 1980s. In Kirkland's time, in place of the French carpets, crystal chandeliers, and silk upholstery seen today, you would have seen Windsor chairs, as well as side chairs with rush-bottom seats, an ingrain carpet, bed curtains of cotton chintz, and no less than 12 beds to accommodate the large family. Very soon after the completion of the house, Kirkland's fortunes began to decline, so it can be assumed that much of the furniture moved into the house upon its completion was the same furniture found here when Kirkland's estate was inventoried 20 years later, following his 1836 death. Going out of the dining room and back into the hall, let's take a left toward the music room, which was likely the former formal parlor or drawing room during Kirkland's ownership. Just to the left of the door is this tall case clock, which still ticks away the seconds and strikes away each hour. While not original to Airmount, it's a fascinating early 19th century piece with a Raleigh provenance and origin. The clock was made by Thomas Emond, a silversmith and clockmaker in Raleigh, as an 1806 commission for William Boylan. Boylan was the editor of Raleigh's first newspaper, the North Carolina Minerva and Raleigh Advertiser, as well as a planter and an advocate of internal improvements for the state. Boylan's press was actually located next door to Emond's clock and jewelry shop on Raleigh's Fayetteville Street. And you can see that on the dial face of the clock, Emond has noted that it was made by him for Mr. Boylan. Clockmaker Thomas Emond first opened his shop in Petersburg, Virginia in 1802, but after 4 years moved south to Raleigh. Advertisements in local newspapers note that he frequently received from New York a handsome assortment of mahogany clock cases and clock materials of every description, so that those who wish to purchase a good 8-day clock can be furnished at the shortest notice. Born in New Jersey, William Boylan had moved to Fayetteville in 1796, where his uncle was a printer and operated a newspaper. 3 years later, Boylan relocated the press to Raleigh, where his newspaper became the voice of the Federalist political party, in much the same way that Joseph Gale's rival paper, the Raleigh Register, was the voice of the Democratic Republican Party. The two editors used their papers to insult the opposing political party and, to a degree, each other. Boylan was quick to attack Jefferson and made insinuations about him at the time of that election. Gale's press caught fire and burned in 1814. He actually accused Boylan of starting the fire. So on the morning of December 4th, 1804, Boylan assaulted his rival editor, Joseph Gales, on the street of Raleigh, just a few blocks from the State House, striking him across the shoulder with a heavy stick. Gales fell to the ground, and Boylan continued beating him mercilessly. Gales later, quote, scrambled off partly upon all fours. That's how Boylan retold it. And Boylan's only punishment for the assault was a fine of $100. And I have to say, this all makes a Twitter war between opposing political commentators in the 21st century seem pretty tame. Believe it or not, Boylan and Gales actually mended their political differences several years later. Boylan later sold his interest in the newspaper, and Gales relocated to Washington, D.C. Boylan served as president of the State Bank of North Carolina and later as one of the commissioners for the construction of the new State House. So for our next trivia question, after leaving Raleigh, newspaper editor Joseph Gales moved to Washington, D.C. in 1804 and became a partner and later sole publisher of this influential 19th century Washington, D.C. newspaper. So stepping back into Airmount's music room, The portrait above the mantle is Thomas Jefferson, of course, by Ezra Ames, an early 19th century copy of Gilbert Stuart's iconic portrait. The plaster bust is also Jefferson there. You see it at the right by the window, a copy of the late 18th century bust by French sculptor Houdon. This room also features the family's piano, a circa 1797 Broadwood grand piano with a case made of mahogany with fruitwood inlay. It's easy to picture one of the Kirkland daughters, or perhaps even Mrs. Kirkland, seated at the instrument and playing some music. John Broadwood, like William Kirkland, was Scottish. A joiner and cabinet maker, he began his career manufacturing harpsichords in London with his father-in-law. By the late 18th century, harpsichords were declining in popularity, and the firm switched exclusively to manufacturing pianos. Broadwood took over ownership of the firm, later bringing his own sons into the partnership. And you can see the cartouche on the Kirkland piano is a John Broadwood and son. Stepping back into the hall and going across to the opposite wing, we step foot in the library. Another gentleman of interest whose portrait and bust are displayed in this room is Judge William Gaston, who in addition to being a congressman and later justice of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, penned the words to the Old North State. And of course, Gastonia is named in his honor. Gaston was a distant relation of the Kirklands. His grandson married William Kirkland's granddaughter. But Gaston has equally interesting ties to Edgewater, another one of Classical American Homes Preservation Trust's properties located on the Hudson River in Dutchess County, New York. You see, Gaston's daughter, Susan, seen here in a portrait by George Cook, was married to Robert Donaldson, originally of Fayetteville. Donaldson and his wife owned a house in New York City, and later several estates, including Edgewater, along the Hudson River. Donaldson is an equally fascinating North Carolinian, and Edgewater is an equally fascinating house, but that's another lecture for another time. The portrait of Judge Gaston is by James Bogle, after an original by his brother, another artist, Robert Bogle. Both James and Robert were known portrait painters throughout Piedmont and Western North Carolina. An 1838 article for the Western Carolinian states that citizens who availed themselves of the opportunity to have their portraits taken by either brother have expressed their perfect satisfaction of the likeness. For our next trivia question, Gaston Hall at this university was named in honor of Judge William Gaston because he was both an early student and later helped the university secure its federal charter. I'll give you a hint, it's his alma mater. Heading upstairs, up that stairway that's probably the work of John Joyner Briggs, we reach the center landing of the second floor and two bedrooms that are located off of it. The steps right there in front of us lead up to the third floor, and that piece of unpainted paneling I showed you earlier is located in this closet beneath the stairs. At any given time, there were children, grandchildren, and sundry other relatives living in the house. So there were a plethora of bedrooms to accommodate the many family members. There are also spaces in the eaves above the wing rooms that were converted to bathrooms in the 20th century to be adjacent to the bedrooms. The master bedroom, seen here, features a chinoiserie theme as furnished by Dick Jenrette in the 1980s. The window treatments, bed hangings, and other decor are by decorator David Byers of Atlanta. And here's the adjacent guest room. One highlight of the third floor is that it features original 19th century paint finishes. So that's something very interesting there. Airmount was a large working plantation with the house at its center. Kirkland would have, of course, relied on an overseer for the operation of the plantation, as his forebears in Scotland were butchers, and while they were skilled in the slaughter and preparation of meat for sale, they would have likely been unfamiliar with agriculture, and especially the raising of corn, tobacco, and cotton, the North Carolina crops that were all vastly different from the barley and oats that were from Kirkland's native Scotland. Kirkland was also an enslaver, owning 12 enslaved individuals in 1800, the year that he published this ad when one of them self-emancipated. These 12 individuals likely included enslaved domestics to work in the house, one or two to assist at the store, and the rest to work the fields and tend the livestock of his estate. The number increased to 19 in 1810, and by 1830, there were 26 enslaved individuals at Airmount. Kirkland's plantation can best be described as diversified agriculture. It wasn't a single crop plantation, but in addition to the growing of crops, herds provided dairy products and wool, as well as sheepskin and cowhides for his tannery. At the time of Kirkland's death in 1836, His inventory noted 22 enslaved individuals. The inventory provides names and gives some other clues as to occupations, such as Joe, the enslaved blacksmith, or Osborne, who was a shoemaker who also served a number of other capacities for the family and is mentioned in numerous family letters. William Kirkland never outwardly addresses his opinion on enslavement in any of his surviving letters, but it was a concept that he would have encountered in North Carolina much more outwardly than in his native Scotland. But I should note, in 1796, nearly 30% of the plantations on the island of Jamaica, a British colony, were owned by Scots, and much of the wealth in Glasgow was the result of tobacco, sugar, and cotton that was grown on Caribbean plantations owned by Scots. By the time Kirkland returned to Scotland for his lengthy visit in 1811-1812, Great Britain had abolished the slave trade, but not the practice of slavery. Still, it would be interesting to know what Kirkland thought of chattel slavery as someone who clearly benefited from it economically. The story of the individuals who were enslaved on the property is an equally important part of the Airmount story, and one that we are dedicated to presenting to visitors in order to tell a more holistic story of this Piedmont plantation. Future plans include conducting more research, both historically as well as looking at the evidence on the ground, archaeological surveys and investigations in hopes to locate sites of the numerous dependency structures that would have been in the vicinity of the house and around the plantation, including the detached kitchen, likely a smokehouse, dairy, ice house, as well as quarters for the enslaved laborers. Elsewhere on the property, there would have been a massive barn, a blacksmith shop, and more quarters for enslaved field workers as well. Similarly, more historical research will help shed light on Airmount as a working plantation and these individuals that were owned by Kirkland and his descendants. Detailed architectural analysis of the house will help us to better understand the changes made by each generation of the family during their occupancy. Additional paint microscopy will provide a full history of paint colors used in the house. Close examination of floorboards for carpet tack evidence will provide insight into which rooms featured the wall-to-wall ingrained carpet that shows up on the inventory. An examination of window and door hardware by my architectural historian colleagues can identify original locks, window sashes, and other key features that will provide equally important clues from the architectural record. The family cemetery, where several generations of the Kirkland family are buried, is located about 200 feet from the house. The second generation of the family, William and Margaret's children, married and established deep familial connections with other local Piedmont families, including the Ruffins and the Camerons. It's also the final resting place for William and Margaret and all but a few of their children, as well as several subsequent generations of the Kirkland family. The first burial was likely an infant son, born and died in 1799, and the latest burial occurred in the family cemetery in 1989. Other family members are buried in the cemetery at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, just half a mile away down St. Mary's Road. In a way, financial difficulty was responsible for the preservation of so many of the original details of Airmount's interior. Just a mere 10 years after the house was completed, William Kirkland's fortunes began to wane. A number of loans he'd guaranteed for former business partners and relatives had come due, meaning he was responsible for the payment. His own business failed, and there were several bad harvests that were partially the result of depleted fertility in the soil. A nationwide panic in 1819, had resulted in lower prices for crops and plummeting land values all across the state of North Carolina and much of the United States. In fact, just a few years before his death, Kirkland learned that he was being sued by the State Bank of North Carolina because he had guaranteed a loan of $3,000 for a friend that was past due. And what you have to realize is credit was a primary form of currency in this era. For someone like William Kirkland to lend his name as a guarantor on notes for friends or relatives was just something one did. But even during a time when he was strapped for cash, Kirkland continued to purchase land. In 1821, he expanded the Airmount tract by acquiring an adjacent 65 acres. The following year, he purchased 200 acres of farmland and a portion of another town lot in Hillsborough, and his financial troubles continued. Without Kirkland's knowledge, his business partner in the Fayetteville store, George McNeil, had endorsed a $20,000 note from one of his family members in the name of the firm. Had Kirkland not encountered so many financial setbacks, the house might have been modernized or further expanded. Similarly, if he had been in sure financial standing and left his children sizable inheritances, it's likely that one of the later generations of owners, such as his son, might have removed and replaced some of those elaborately carved mantles with a more Victorian-style marble mantles, or done similar alterations to the interior of the house. But thankfully, that did not occur, and all these original elements are preserved. At the time of William Kirkland's death in 1836, he owed at least $30,000 principally to 3 individuals. In today's money, that debt amounts to more than $750,000. But one benefit of his insolvency for historians and curators like myself is that there's a sizable paper trail relating to the settlement of the estate. The inventory of the household, the records from the resulting sale, and additional court records related to the payment of his debts, help us to understand the house and property during his ownership. The estate would have to be inventoried in order to determine the total amount of Kirkland's assets. Every chair in the house, bushel of corn in his storehouse, and cow in the pasture had to be inventoried and valuated by his executors. Not only does the inventory provide clues about the furnishings of the house in the various rooms, but it also provides the names of those enslaved individuals under Kirkland's ownership, 10 of whom were sold so that the proceeds of the sale could go toward paying off his debts. Most of the household furnishings were sold to son Alexander Mackenzie Kirkland, purchasing on his mother's behalf. As part of a likely gentleman's agreement, no one would have bid against the family, so they might cheaply buy back the contents of the house. This brings me to the next trivia question. William Kirkland's son Alexander Mackenzie Kirkland was named in honor of a distant relative by marriage, Sir Alexander Mackenzie, a British-born explorer who accomplished this notable feat in 1793. Margaret Kirkland, William's widow, would only live for 3 more years, dying in 1839. Following her death, another sale took place where her 2 unmarried daughters, Mary and Susan, purchased the Airmount property, much of the furnishings, and several of the family's enslaved individuals. Their brother John, seen here in a later photo, repurchased the property from them and became the next owner of Airmount, living there with his family until his death in 1879. During the Civil War, 4 of John Kirkland's sons fought for the Confederacy. Which brings me to our final trivia question. Even though he was kicked out of West Point following numerous infractions, William Kirkland's grandson and namesake, William Wedby Kirkland, eventually rose to this rank in the Confederate Army. John Kirkland's daughter Susan, also known as Sue May, born at Airmount in 1843, was a longtime educator, teaching at Raleigh's Peace Institute from 1881 to 1892, and later serving as lady principal at UNC Greensboro from 1892 to 1914. John Kirkland Jr., his wife Harriet, and their 7 children were the next occupants of Airmount. As William and Margaret Kirkland's grandson, he became the 3rd generation of the family to own the property. From John Jr., the title passed to several of his children until finally his youngest son, Samuel Kirkland, born in 1883, became the final Kirkland family member generation, to own Airmount. It was during his ownership that the Historic American Buildings Survey documented the house and undertook the measured drawings and photographs that you see here and that I've used throughout my lecture. At his death in 1971, the property passed to his widow, who later sold it to Dick Jenrette in 1985. Tonight, I've showed you just a portion of the house, and once times are more favorable and Airmount is able to safely host tours, I hope you all will be able to visit. In the meantime, as I noted at the onset of my lecture, the walking trails are open and the fall colors along the river are amazing. As Dick Jenrette said in 2000, the more he read and learned about Airmount, he realized that it really told the story of North Carolina. And I think that's especially evident when you look at all these different aspects of North Carolina history and just some of which I've mentioned this evening that occurred on this property. So thank you very much. I also wanted to include some suggestions if anyone wants to read a little more about the Kirkland family, about Dick Jenrette and his renovations of Airmount, or just some of the architecture that I discussed this evening as well. And I also wanted to mention a couple of websites, including our own website, Classical American Homes Preservation Trust, and a couple of others to look at as well. So if we're ready, I'm going to share the answers to the trivia questions, and I'll be curious to see how people did. And then so here we go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well now, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, we have quite a few questions here. Our first one is, could you tell us please where William Kirkland's store was located in Hillsborough?
I don't know the exact address, I'm embarrassed to say, but he did he had the earlier store that again, the family tradition is the family was actually living above the store, and he had a number of stores in the area. Like I said, several were operated as partnerships with other individuals, including some in there was one in Fayetteville and several other towns around the region as well. But yes, I apologize for not knowing the exact location of his Hillsborough store.
Okay. Skipping across the ocean, we have a question about Kirkland's travel from London to Edinburgh. I don't know whether there were railroads in 1810. Did he have to go that whole way by carriage?
Yes, I imagine they went overland, which yes, that would have been quite a journey. And I should say what's interesting about that is during that trip, his 9-year-old son, John, actually remained in Scotland for several years with, I'm getting a request to repost the trivia answers. So I'm going to share my screen again. So, and leave that up. But sorry, so John Kirkland actually went with William on that trip to Scotland. John stayed in Scotland with several of William's relatives, got his education there, and then came back to Hillsborough in North Carolina after being gone for something like 6 years. It actually may have been even longer than that.
Okay, one question here gets a little spooky. I have to ask, have there been reports of unexplained activity in the house?
That I do not know. I will say, though, it's a house like many historic houses where there were a number of people who lived, and yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but.
Okay, moving on to some architectural questions. Are the stars in the craft work, I believe on the mantelpiece, Moravian?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I'm the first to admit I'm a curator. I'm not an architectural historian, but that's a very interesting avenue to pursue looking at. And I will say too, that's what's so interesting about Airmount is that we have documentation on the various craftsmen who worked there. And again, it's a lot of the same craftsmen who worked at Farintosh and a number of the other properties in the region, which is pretty significant. But yeah, and I think that's one of the things, again, that's so interesting about the property and the house, excuse me, are the those very ornately carved mantles and some of the other architectural details, and the fact that they survived, that they weren't, taken out at some point in the later 19th century, and that they all survive.
We have a question. We saw the graves of the family. Do you know if there are enslaved persons' graves, and if so, where they are?
I do not know. Oh, thank you. Someone stopped sharing my screen. But again, like I said in my lecture, one of the things that we want to do is to do more, surveying of the property and do a lot more historical research as well to learn more about the individuals who were enslaved here and through the different generations of the family.
Okay, we do have one more request. Please repost the book references.
Oh, gladly. Excuse me, let me share mine. So let me go to, there's the books, and then I'll leave this up for just a moment, and then I'll go back to the website references as well.
Okay. We have a pretty recent question. What did Mr. Jenrette pay for the house, if that is known?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure that's a known.
Okay. Well, those are the questions we
Okay.
have so far. We do have a fair amount of thank yous, and it was a fantastic tour and very interesting.
And like I said, the house will remain closed for at least the rest of 2020. Hopefully in the, future conditions will be more conducive. We will be out of the pandemic, and we will be able to welcome visitors back into the house once again. But like I said, the trails are all still open. I highly recommend, for all of you that live in the region, to go out there, enjoy a nice socially distant hike, the Poets Walk, a good 1 mile loop trail, or there's a number of other extensive trails that the Airmount trails loop into as well.
Okay, we have a couple more questions came in. Where was the kitchen located?
There was likely a detached kitchen, and then there's some question about a room in the house that may have been a warming kitchen that requires a little more architectural investigation. But as typical in most 18th and 19th century houses, the kitchen was a detached structure. That's of course because in many instances, a fire was burning continually in the kitchen for the preparation of food, boiling of water. And so there was always inherently a fire risk. So one reason kitchens were kept separately was to minimize a fire risk. Food was stored in there, so they were often very attractive for rodents. And so a number of reasons. So yes, the kitchen was likely located right somewhere off the back of the house. And that's where it's going to be very interesting to do some more in-depth archaeological surveys to locate some of those more dependency structures, because often archaeological surveys and excavations around those types of structures provides amazing evidence about what sort of food is being consumed, what sort of porcelain, earthenwares, glassware is being used, that sort of thing.
Okay, we have two more that I'm going to bundle a bit because
Okay.
they have to do with original acreage and nowadays. So we have a question about how many acres are owned currently of the original 505, and are there maps of those trails that we can download?
Yes, I will say with it's 300 plus something acres at current now. And I'm sorry, I don't know the exact number, but yes, I would recommend there's information about the Airmount trails on the Classical American Homes website. And that's a good source. And you can, yes, so I would suggest going there. And
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Sorry. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and we still have some questions coming, so people are fascinated.
Excellent. I will do my best to answer them. So,
okay, let's see. When was all the woodwork painted? That's not original, right?
There's some paint. It was painted most recently, I believe. Well, as part of Mr. Jenret's renovation, some of it was painted, but they did some paint analysis then to look at what some of the original colors were. And that's, again, something we're very interested in looking at some additional paint analysis, because you think about a painted wall is very much like a layer cake. Each time a new coat of paint gets added, it gets an additional layer. So a paint specialist, a paint conservator can take a microscopic sample with a razor blade and really just look at a slight sliver from that wall and look at all the different paint histories and date different layers of paint based on chemical composition and other characteristics. For instance, if it contains a certain element that wasn't in existence until after 1850, then you can say, oh, this layer of paint doesn't date to before 1850. But yeah, it's a fascinating house. And again, it's just amazing that so much of this, these architectural details survive.
We have a question about, speaking of survivors, are there still any Kirklands around?
That is a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I know I presume there are. There are, like I said, really the last family member, of course, that line of direct descendants that the house passed through. The last one, like I said, passed away in the 70s, but I know there are other collateral descendants and things.
We have one comment about Airmount, and it's, in the 1970s, one of our family horses retired to Airmount. There were several cinder block tenant houses right next to the main house at that time.
Okay, yes, I know as part of the renovation, the cinder block houses were removed. But okay, that's an interesting story.
Okay. Well, those are the questions we have. Like I said before, we have a lot of thank yous and wonderful presentation and very interesting.
I'm so glad everybody enjoyed it, and I hope everybody did well on the trivia as well. So.
Over to you, Stacy.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you so much, Grant, for that wonderful presentation. It was so interesting. I learned a lot and definitely excited to head out and check out Airmount, those nice socially distanced trails you mentioned. And thank you to all those of you who joined us this evening. We hope that you'll join us for our next History and Highballs Bourbon! Happening on Wednesday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. Hope all of you take care, and we will see you all soon. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.